This is Jessica from Turn the Page podcast. Today's episode features Sarah Marshall, co-host of You're Wrong About, the popular podcast that debunks conspiracy theories and challenges you to look at history in a new way. Among the many topics covered in this episode, conspiracy theories surrounding child abuse and human trafficking are touched upon, while none of the incidents discussed are actually true. Due to the sensitive nature of these topics, we wanted to give our listeners a heads up before continuing with the episode.
Welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hi, this is Jessica with Syosset Library's Turn the Page podcast. My librarian co-host today is...
Hello, I'm Sharon Long. I'm the head of teen services at the Syosset Public Library.
And we are super excited to invite our guest here today, another podcaster, but like a podcaster supreme.
Yeah, that's so lovely to get called a podcaster supreme. That makes me feel like a really, like an ice cream dessert that like if you finish it, you get a shirt to wear. Which is amazing. I host a podcast called You're Wrong About with my co-host Michael Hobbs. We've been making it for about 2.5 years. It's about looking at misremembered history and talking about what the real story was, and has expanded over time to just kind of play around with history and not always be debunking myths, but just talking about trying to connect with the humanity of historical figures. That's one of the things that I like to do with it too. And I have a second podcast that I just started this summer called Why Are Dads, which the more I say that title, the more it sounds to me like Why Are Dads, but it is Why Are Dads? And it's watching a movie a week and talking about the theme of dadhood in it. So we've already watched a Kevin Costner movie.
Awesome. Yeah, that title is pretty great for Sharon and myself because we're both moms, and there are times we're both like, why
are dads?
Why are dads?
Why are dads blank? And then you can fill it in. And then like when you search why are dads on Google, like a lot of unsettling stuff comes up, and you're like, are dads okay? And some of them are, and some of them are not so much, and that's a theme too.
So when Sharon and I began talking about interviewing you, one of the things that came up is that as librarians, we love telling people that they're wrong about stuff.
In a nice way.
In a professional way.
In a professional way. Like you never bring a librarian to a dinner party unless you want them to be like, actually.
Cross-referencing, yes, exactly.
Really? You think that? Let me look that up for you. You're wrong about that. So how did You're Wrong About come about?
I mean, it started because Mike and I had gotten in touch because I published an article about Tanya Harding, which is very much in the You're Wrong About theme of being like, what if this woman like wasn't the arch villain of this whole story the way we've acted for 20 years? And that was like an exciting enough idea that article got some attention. Mike was one of the people who read it. He wrote a letter to me telling me that he messaged me on Tumblr, but he messaged me on Tumblr and wrote a very nice note saying how much he liked the piece, and that stuck with me, and I remembered it. I remembered it when we got in touch again, and so because of that essay, I was the person that he first asked to collaborate on this podcast idea that he had, which was to reconsider history. And his only concern at the time was that it was a fun idea, but like maybe we wouldn't have enough material to do more than like 20 episodes, and we just did our 100th one. So
wow.
So he was wrong about that.
So I've listened to bunch of episodes in preparation for today, and I know that sometimes you have co-collaborators that come on and will speak with you, and I was just sort of curious about how the idea, once you have an idea for an episode, the process goes into it.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely have ideas that don't pan out, and often I have a few ideas kind of floating around that I sort of work on for a period and then set aside and pick up again. I really like being able to work that way. And I used to be, a freelancer. And when I did that, I had much less time to develop an idea. Once you pick something, you're on a track to completion, pretty much. And so being able to think about something and then set it aside for a while and talk about it when I really feel ready, like that's what I really like to do. And so I have, for example, one of the episodes I'm working on now is on lie detector tests. And the story that I want to tell about that is that the polygraph test that we know as the lie detector test today was invented by William Moulton Marston, who also invented Wonder Woman. Yes.
Yes.
And has a whole fun, saucy history there.
Super saucy.
Super saucy. And, thrown in there is the fact that like the polygraph test kind of like binds its subject, and Wonder Woman, was always tying up criminals and getting tied up. And, that was that's also a theme that you can follow.
Fun fact, it's a polygraph test, and he was also polyamorous, so bunch.
There you go.
I've never heard that joke before. I love that. That's so good.
My coffee is firing on all cylinders.
Yes. That joke has been waiting to be claimed, like the sword and the stone, and you got it.
I got it.
Yeah, I love that. That's a thing of
Bravo.
beauty. Yes, he's the poly inventor. And I think that the idea of a lie detector test and like our need as a people to believe that a flawless lie detector can be made by human hands, which is very hubristic. And our sort of superhero fantasies of detectives, and the fact that Batman really, at least in the beginning, when he began, was, the world's greatest detective. These are all themes that are sort of like swirling around my head, but I feel like I'm not going to be ready to do this episode probably for at least another month, because I just want to keep kind of thinking about it and reading other stuff and noticing things that seems to connect with the themes I already know I'm going to talk about, and just kind of, living in the world and pulling stuff in. And then eventually that, the topic feels ready. So I really like being able to have that time to do it. And I think Mike, my co-host, tends to be more efficient with his time. And often also, he's a features writer for the Huffington Post. So he'll often do an essay that he researches, because we take turns researching and then presenting to each other. He quite often will do an essay that connects with the piece that he's publishing with the Huffington Post. So you can also have this experience of getting a subject matter in both features and kind of conversational podcast format, which I really like that he does.
So as far as your research process, like, do you have, well, nowadays, obviously some libraries are open, some are only digital, like any, ways that you tend to research, or is it always different every time, or how do you go about the process?
A big part of my research process often is out of print books, and I'm actually very fond of like celebrity memoirs, because they're often something that was in print briefly and then that everyone kind of moved on from, but that there's interesting stuff in. So like a good example is Cato Kalin's unauthorized biography that was made by a ghostwriter that he was working with, and had done all these taped interviews and then backed out of the project at the last second, and the publisher went ahead and did it anyway. So it has this, this troubled kind of sleazy history, but there is really, to me, extremely interesting information about the whole O.J. Simpson saga, which we've done several episodes on, that I haven't seen anywhere else. So that kind of thing is often the first thing that I look for to see if there's something I can find. And there usually is. And there's often books by like women tangentially connected to major news stories or scandals that have almost always gone out of print. And there's always something interesting, like books by wives and girlfriends, and just sort of, the women in the background of these stories. I always love if I can find those.
Sounds like a really great display idea at the library.
Yeah, I know.
Dig up these old books.
Behind the
Totally.
scenes.
Yeah.
Yes. I mean,
Women
yeah, and in the O.J. Simpson
story.
story, O.J. Simpson's girlfriend at the time that he was at trial, Paula Barbieri, had a memoir that came out in 1998 and fairly quickly went out of print. And if you did like a out of print memoirs of maligned women display, that would be a great centerpiece.
I feel like Obi-Wan Kenobi, because I'm like, oh, Barbieri, that's a name I haven't heard of in a long time. But it just like snaps back. I was about 12 years old when that whole thing happened. And, I remember riffing on what I heard a lot of adults say about it. And, looking back on it, I'm like, I didn't really understand it. And neither did, like, there was so much that they weren't getting.
Yeah. I guess the stuff that, like, as a kid that you don't understand, like, may actually reflect on the fact that, adults are failing to understand something because they have these, very adult ideas about what people are like and how society works that maybe aren't true.
I very distinctly remember hearing my father say it was if it happened, it was a crime of passion. And then like being like this 12-year-old being like, yeah, like if he did it, it was a crime of like, what?
Yeah.
What?
Yeah. It's like revisiting history. Like we also, look at how our thinking and our responses were influenced by the adults around us when we were like, children and adolescents. And like, that's a weird and it's an amazing thing. Yeah. To realize just what you believed or believed you believed at various times in your life.
Which leads me to what is basically been just this absolute escalation of misinformation and, crazy conspiracy theories being mainstreamed lately. And I know the Wayfair piece, which was, you said it was a mini episode, but I'm like, this is a full episode.
Yeah, whenever Mike calls something a mini episode, he's setting himself up to do something longer than he thinks. Like, I don't know why he says that.
Seemed pretty full to me. It was good. Full of info,
but it's crazy, and it's crazy how much and I guess you could pretty much say this about anything, how much emotion plays into what somebody is willing to believe and how much of their mind they're willing to stretch.
Yeah
That whole episode was absolutely phenomenal.
I mean, I just had a call with someone else this morning who I was catching up with in a social capacity, and they were like, kind of mentioned QAnon, and I was like, all right, I'll describe some QAnon. So it's sort of, it's everywhere now. It's very funny. Like, this is something that used to be a pretty fringy phenomenon, in which I used to see as basically an elaborate fan fiction to, to sell the theory that Donald Trump is doing a good job, actually.
And to be honest with you, I just want to throw something out there, because this kind of came to mind last night. I remember John Teeter being a thing. Yes, like supposedly there was this guy in the early days of the internet who claimed he was a time traveler and that all of this stuff was going to happen, and these fringy people really believed he was a real person, and he wasn't. And like the stuff that he was talking about didn't happen. And I think much later in time, the person who was posing as him was like, it was me. But maybe I'm wrong about that. I have to go back and look.
But it's probably something like that. But
it's very similar in the case that somebody's coming out and being like, hi, I'm Q, I'm this person, and I know this stuff, and it's just blown up.
Yeah. Well, and there's a really great episode of the Reply All podcast that I think is their most recent episode, about a very convincing theory about the actual identity of Q. And I think the issue with that is that even if the person or people who have been, posting as Q and spreading these conspiracy theories that basically, boil down to a narrative where President Trump is busting child sex predators, and is taking down a ring of elite child predators who often are famous liberal stars or Democrats, members of the Democratic Party and Democratic Party officials. And it spiraled into this very interesting kind of COVID narrative hybrid, where one of the memes you see a lot just going around places like Instagram is the idea that the attempt to get people to wear masks is actually put forth by the this cabal of child traffickers, because they want your child in a mask so they can kidnap them more easily. And so it feels to me as if the sort of QAnon narrative has gone mainstream by managing to sort of connect with, integrate, the very reasonable fears of parents who like do understand themselves to be living in an incredibly dangerous time and like are right about that, but I think who can't. I think there's a lot of people who correctly perceive the amount of jeopardy that this administration is putting them and their children in, but can't bring themselves to name the source of that jeopardy. And so if you get sold a story where it's actually Tom Hanks who wants to be preying on your children, which is one of the QAnon theories, and you're like, yeah, it's Tom Hanks. That's why I feel this scared all the time, because of the star of Turner and Hooch.
I was just going to say Toy Story 4 wasn't my favorite, but I hardly blame it.
Yeah, I know. Like Toy Story 4 was a little depressing, but like, come
I had
on.
some issues with Toy Story 4.
He didn't write it.
But, I mean.
Leave the guy alone. He did his best.
He's been through enough. He's had a rough 2022, people.
Yeah. But I think like just the whole idea behind, okay, so now you have this furniture company, and one of the things I loved about it was that you talk about the algorithms that these companies use to price their products depending on what it is. So like, so Wayfair is in supposedly trafficking children, and I know you talk a lot about that word and how it's what is it, like you keep using that word, I don't think it means what you think it means.
Exactly.
But through like these chests that they're charging people thousands of dollars for because the chest has the name of a person, and I don't think a lot of people, including myself, because obviously I didn't believe that, but I didn't really understand why certain things seem to be priced in this outrageous way. And what I loved about that episode was not only did you break down everything involving the the child trafficking Wayfair conspiracy, but also like, why is it that like some websites sell a pillow for $600? Like, which
and
I thought was
it's because it's like Marc Jacobs, and sometimes, as in Wayfair, it's the reason that it turned out to be was because you don't want to delist an item because you have it out of stock, because then your results are going to be less searchable and you're going to fall in the algorithm. So instead of taking it out of circulation, you just list it really high, and then no one's going to try to buy it. And then when you have it in stock again, you put it at a normal price. Yeah. And I love that kind of information, because it's the kind of, I think that conspiracy theories really flourish in what I think of as like various damp areas, that just promote the sort of mold of conspiracy. And one of those, hospitable circumstances is like, if there's an industry or just a situation where like the average random person on the internet doesn't understand the logistics of it, and they can fill in that blank space with something sinister, which like we don't need something particularly confusing to do that with. So, most people aren't selling stuff on Wayfair. If it were eBay, I think people would be less credulous about this kind of thing, because it's such a more common experience to be selling items on eBay. But it was something where there was enough confusion worked into the equation for people to sort of fill it in with a lot of conspiracy. And that was what they did.
A lot of weird coincidences as well, with like the names of the missing girls, and then the names of the product line, and then the one girl was like, "I'm not missing. Get me."
Oh yeah, really.
Of this, and
But when you think about it, like also, like they've been naming furniture after, like with giving furniture people names forever, and
I was just looking at curtains on Anthropology or something like last night that are like the Juliet curtains.
Juliet's
it's like
been a popular name for a few years.
Right. Yeah. And just like I think that I think there's actually it's weird because like this does get at an interesting story, but it's just a different one. Like you could argue that like the way that we title pieces of furniture is an attempt to like make them more sale, or like to explain to the buyer like what the gendered connotation of the piece is supposed to be, which like that's weird. It's not suggesting like a big child trafficking conspiracy, but like it's kind of odd. Like I just was looking at a couch that's called the Sven, and I feel like that's to encourage maybe men to buy it because it's velvet, and maybe they're like, men won't buy a velvet couch, we'll call it the Sven. It's like how they did the big like ice harvesting scene at the start of Frozen to be like, don't worry, it's for boys, you know. So like that's an interesting story, but it's not as interesting.
Then it's sophisticated and you'll entertain on a Sven.
Come sit on my Sven. Yeah.
I know that Sharon, did you want to talk about was it the diet one or the food?
Oh, that was so interesting. Yeah, the episode about the obesity epidemic, and
in quotation marks.
You know, there's of course, and just the fact that like, you know, so much research and knowledge has been out there for what, like 60 years. There are all these studies proving that, like you said, like diets don't work, and everything is just kind of manipulating an audience to try to get them to buy all these different diet products and you know, exercise equipment and things to lose weight. And we're still falling for the same hook, line, and sinker, you know, when it's so much of that was science and metabolism. And I just, what really stuck with me as somebody who has, you know, had different variances in, you know, my weight over the years, and especially having been pregnant and then trying to lose the baby weight, is the fact that you said that your body, or that the studies said that, you know, whatever the highest weight that your body had sort of ever kind of registered at is the number that your body is continually trying to get back up to. And it's like a survival kind of instinct back from, I guess, caveman times, so that, you know, you had enough fat on your body, the hunt didn't go well and whatever, and how it's constantly like you're fighting against that. And, you know, the way we're approaching it to keep trying to lose and then having this yo-yo situation bounce you back up is just so counterproductive. And it was just it was a fascinating podcast. I just sat there listening like, oh my God, that makes sense. That makes sense. And so I just wanted to, you know, as far as your take on that and, you know, uncovering that sort of information, just curious to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, that was an episode that I'm really happy that I was a part of, and can't take credit really for the, you know, the bulk of it, because my co-host Mike, like this was his baby, this project he'd been working on for I think close to a year. I think he mentions it at the top of the episode that this was one that connected to a piece that he had published, and it was, I think, one of the 2 most read pieces that the Huffington Post published that year or ever, or something like that. And the response that we got to that episode too, you know, continues to be just really amazing to me. It's really, you know, from the time that we released it, there was this real outpouring of responses from people who felt very seen by it, and felt like just like hearing people agree with science was this extremely liberating thing to hear. And it sucks that was such a unnecessary thing to put out into the world, because it's so obvious. But I feel like that's, you know, that is the moral of a lot of the episodes we do, is like, listen to science, look at what we actually know about the thing that happened, you know, because like one of the other, you know, I feel like we get too much credit for research. Mike just talked about this with regard to a piece that he just published debunking this viral tweet that was going around a few weeks ago about 39 children being found in a double wide trailer in a sex trafficking bust. And, you know, there was no double wide trailer ever. Like that detail just got totally invented. And it's very funny to me because, like, you can't, I mean, maybe you could physically fit that many children in a double wide trailer, but like you would have to warehouse them in coffins, like the way Catherine Deneuve stores her old lovers in The Hunger. Like it's just too weird. It's like I think like I've heard stories of people who hoard like small dogs, having that many small dogs in a trailer, but it's just like a completely invented detail that came out of nowhere. And then the actual story is like there were 39 children who were located across many counties, and many were just, returned to their parents or returned to the care situation that they were in, and potentially to a worse situation than they were in by having escaped. And I think one person was arrested on something related to human trafficking or sex trafficking, which is a term that applies to basically anytime a minor has sex for something of value, including a place to stay that night. So like someone being arrested for that connotes that something bad was happening. And that remains true. But I think throwing that phrase around as if, this story in Georgia is not a sad and complicated story about kids trying to find some safety in a variety of complicated situations. And instead it's like this magical trailer that has like all of these stolen children in it. That's creating a story where where abuse has to be spectacular and almost unbelievable in order to be worthy of our attention, which I think is dangerous, because most abusive situations are everyday and mundane and implicate people who don't come off as evil, but who we still have to take seriously for their capacity to do harm. And so Mike, in order to debunk that story, I believe made like 2 phone calls. Like he called, whoever was responsible for carrying out this operation and was like, hey, just to check, like, let me run these things by you. And that was it. A lot of these things, the truth is not that hard to find. Like the truth, it's not that the truth is out there, it's that the truth is like right here, but it's just hard to integrate it.
The call is coming from inside the house.
Yeah, always.
So just kind of scrolling through, just some of the things you talked about. First of all, it jumps out because it was about, 4 to 5 years ago that killer clowns descended upon the U.S.
Yeah, that time really flies.
And then just vanished into thin air.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then there's that, but then there's I don't want to gloss over killer clowns because they're a perennial favorite. The Tuskegee syphilis story is another one that, to be honest with you, the first time I really started hearing about it was listening to you guys.
Yeah, I think another thing that is apparent to me working on this is there's so much stuff where I've been like, why didn't I know that? And it's like, I don't know, I've been reading this whole time. And like, I think realizing the holes that you had in your education is another thing that working on this show does for me, because I think, this is something that I never heard a whisper of in high school. And that seems amazing to me. And there was other stuff that I was taught, in a way that I'm really grateful for. Like I went to, had 5 years of my elementary and middle school years in Hawaii. And so because of that, we had like a lot of history on, the state of Hawaii being made a state by the United States and being annexed, for various capitalistic ends in a way that was, horrifically unjust to the Hawaiian people. And that was part of the education that I got at an otherwise pretty linear thinking, like Episcopalian school that it, I think had a kind of respectability and sort of stuffiness that to me was really amazing to find in concert with that like fairly radical way of thinking, considering everything. So it's like I don't know, it's interesting to sort of assess like what did I learn and what did I not learn, and how much of that is based on what was made available to me and how much of it is based on what I sought out and why was that. Like it just, every question inspires more questions.
Also, just as far as filling gaps in our education and learning things later in life that we never learned in school, there seems to be almost like a movement now. And I know, Jess, in the community here, there's actually a movement to sort of diversify the curriculum at the high school to try to include more diversity learning. And, I just recently, we were watching the amazing HBO show Watchmen. And I know so many people, myself, my husband, a lot of people who were watching only learned about the Tulsa race massacre through Watchmen this very year. And we consider ourselves, you know, pretty educated people. And we're angry that, like, you know, there were things that, like, they were just left out of, you know, our education. So I think, you know, that part of it, like, where, you know, your podcast has these topics that sort of fill these gaps. It's something that we're sort of seeing a lot of, like, this want to fill the gaps. You know, we really are looking for that. There's like this need to, you know, the people who want the truth and want facts get enough of it.
Yeah.
Like, you know, but then there's like the people who like want the truth and they really want to follow the research in the rabbit hole to either, like, the truth is the call is coming from inside the house, like what we were talking about, or the truth is uncomfortable. And I wonder why some people are willing to believe a false, uncomfortable, quote unquote, truth that's not the truth, but they get so incensed at hearing something that's another uncomfortable truth that is true. It has like this visceral, and I know that there's a term for it when you're talking about the study of, you know, just like falsified news and all of that, like an emotional reaction that you get when you hear, was it confirmation bias? There's you know, when you hear something that kind of goes against, and you just like, no, like you just get this hot button.
Yeah, I'm not sure, but I mean, it's enduringly mysterious. Like, I think there are some, to me, like the theme of a clear villain is like a big theme in telling the difference between like what scary theories people are willing to believe versus which ones they're willing to reject or compelled to reject. Because, you know, the whole QAnon thing, like, there's a clear set of villains in it, and the motivation of the villains is to be evil, you know, and I find that extremely interesting as kind of a way of, I think, probably like pretty American thinking. Like, I know that ideas about evil are innate to humanity, but like, I think that perhaps we as a culture are maybe especially fond of the concept. Like, I showed my mom recently, who loves British mysteries and raised me on Agatha Christie adaptations. We watched this very wonderful bad movie called Mindhunters, which is like a slasher version of And Then There Were None, where there's a bunch of FBI profilers on an island getting killed gorily one by one. And then my mom could only watch the first half, and then the next day she was like, how did it end? Who did it? And I was like, oh, it was this person. And she was like, oh, what was their motive? And I was like, being a serial killer. Like, that's the motive of a serial killer in a serial killer movies. And you don't know that because you don't watch horror movies, you watch British mysteries. And I love how in British mysteries, as far as I can tell, it's that you very rarely have someone who's just evil. They're like, the vicar got me pregnant before the war and I never recovered emotionally, and like, you know, and he destroyed my life, and so I must kill him and his new family. And you're like, all right, like, that was extreme, but like, I do understand, like, that at least you think that you have a reason, you know, as opposed to just the villain whose motive is just being evil. And, you know, the QAnon conspiracy theory, I think, is alluring because there's, you know, the fake villains in it are allegedly doing, you know, horrible things to children, like torturing children in order to extract drugs from them, making shoes out of their skin, like really ornate, like fairy tale type stuff. And the people that are in power right now and who are doing, you know, the most damage to the United States are like, they don't wake up in the morning and think about how evil they are. They're making money. And like, that's the root of a lot of the darkness here. And like, that's kind of upsetting to contemplate. Isn't it better to think about like maniac Tom Hanks, you know, being a child murderer? Like, you would think that would be more upsetting, but it appears to be less upsetting.
It is just interesting, just the outlandishness that people are willing to stretch to. But this is like far from the first time that anybody has. And I know that you are working on a book, which I know I've previously before we started recording, already have invited you to talk to us about. But
I love that. I have my first promotional tour stop.
Yes, you've heard it here first on Turn the Page.
Yeah.
I love it. Because I guess was it mostly the 80s, the Satanic Panic, but it was like the late 70s, 80s, early 90s. Like people, like there was conspiracies about like people keeping children in the daycare, and it's and like people's lives, like just regular people's lives, were ruined by these conspiracies, and there was no internet then,
right? Yeah,
yeah,
and I mean, the way it is really interesting to try and look at the difference between the ways these rumors spread in a pre and post internet time, because I almost feel like it's similar to like the difference between the Black Plague and coronavirus. It's like, let's see how, misinformation and rumors or dangerous disease spreads like in a time of like slow travel or a time of like, instantaneous round the globe spread of humans and goods and information. And it turns out it's different, because the first whisperings of QAnon, by definition, it's a post-Trump phenomenon. Although the Michelle remembers kind of spark lighting the Satanic Panic fire, like that did happen surprisingly fast, because I see the publication of Michelle Remembers in 1980 as like the beginning of it all, in a, if we're gonna, in the same way that like it's hard to say when exactly a lot of big cultural movements begin sort of at their earliest stages, but that was sort of, I think, the moment that this became a phenomenon for, the average secular American.
Moral panics pop up from time to time, and unfortunately people who have like no idea what's going on are the ones who get hurt, become a target, be it like witch hunts, quote unquote, where they're just like some women who are a little weird, or maybe you're jealous because you think your husband is hitting on her and suddenly she's a witch, or like she used an herb and she's a witch.
Or like your milk curdled and she like passed your house on the road that day, and like,
she's clearly a witch. She has a wart. But but this just kind of, it's just, and I think as librarians, with like I know myself, and I don't know if I'm pretty sure I can speak for Sharon as well. Like we are predisposed to follow a thread, but sometimes emotions we're just humans. Like sometimes emotions get the best of us, and like to tell yourself, even someone who's a reasoned researching person, to dial it back a few and be like, okay, let's discuss this. I mean, in general, I know like a lot of people, there was like that Go Ask Alice memoir from the 60s about drugs, which was fabricated from different stories of, I believe, a therapist, or just like it wasn't like there was really no Alice. Alice was an amalgam.
It was a teaching book. It was written to teach a lesson. Yeah, definitely.
And the lesson is, don't do pot, because pot will send you over the edge into, your life, all the speed that you injected straight into your body before, like, that was the gateway to pot. Yeah, that book is amazing.
But there's so many people who still think it was like a real memoir of a real person. And there was, and again, like that comes out of a time with a lot of emotion and a lot of controversy.
Well, and I think there's a sunk cost fallacy at work there too, because if you have believed something for like your entire life, because people grew up reading Go Ask Alice. I grew up reading it. I got bored quickly because I had a really short attention span and I liked books about dragons. But like, I remember reading the start of it as a fifth grader, and I remember that being, everyone just agreeing that it was nonfiction. It was like so scary because it was this real girl's diary. And so I feel like the amount of belief that you put into an idea, it seems pretty clear that like that correlates directly to being more likely to stick with it once you get, strong evidence to the contrary.
I think also there's something kind of powerful about something being attributed to anonymous.
Yes.
Like there's something that does to people that makes it like, so like you just, you can't get enough of it. And I don't know why, but right. It just, that book for me was like, well, it has to be true. It's by somebody anonymous. They didn't even want to put their name on it.
I remember feeling, go on, sorry.
No. And then you look at like, what's going on, like the group Anonymous,
Right.
It's just, right. It's kind of like,
well, or QAnon, right? The ultimate, like, the ultimate anon of this century. Yeah. And or so far. Yeah. And I mean, there's an episode of Hey Arnold, I think, where Arnold writes a love poem to this girl that he likes and signs it Anonymous. And she's like, Anonymous wrote all those famous poems. Like, I got a love poem from Anonymous.
Definitely a name having power.
Yeah.
It's not what they think.
Yeah. No, but I mean, it's powerful. And I think, it's funny, when I was a kid, I was very attached to the idea, the sort of frame story of The Princess Bride, because William Goldman, apparently what happened is that he was writing this book and there were parts of it that he just like didn't feel like writing or felt blocked about. And so he creates the frame story that he is abridging this book by this other author named S. Morgenstern. And there's this very long, boring, complete version out there. But he's abridged it for the kids. And so for years of my childhood, I believed that there was a complete Princess Bride and that William Goldman didn't really write it, even though it's like very obvious if you've read any of his other novels that this is the same person with the same writing style. But it's like a lovely story, and it is a children's book. And like, this is a lovely hoax for children that like, I got to have this sort of rite of passage of like realizing there was no S. Morgenstern. And also I think realizing sort of in a path to adult authorhood and to also having a career as a writer, like recognizing that sometimes adopting a pseudonym like frees you up and maybe makes you capable of writing this lovely, like pretty idealistic love story when you've previously been writing thrillers about Nazis.
It's interesting. I think the most recent "you're wrong about" moment I had, and this one kind of killed me just a little bit inside, was I really thought that I had researched this at one point, was my husband and I were talking about Amadeus. And I'm not going to say that I thought that Amadeus was a true story, because that I know, but I had heard, and I really thought that I'd read that the actor who played Mozart was so disturbed by playing that role that he quit acting.
Oh, wow.
And I can't find that anywhere.
I've never heard that story, but it feels believable, right?
It feels believable.
Like,
yeah,
and that's good acting.
Because he wasn't, and it was a disturbing role, and he hasn't really done much since. But like, what I did find out in trying to figure out whether or not this was true, and then had to eat crow and tell my husband I was wrong about this, was that laugh that he has in the movie, he had trouble doing it more than once, so it was on a loop.
I don't like knowing that.
I'm sorry. I should say. I can't do it. It's hard. But again,
it's a tough one.
It's a tough one. I know, it kills me. But like, still at the same time, I'm like, I'm like, no, wait, I know. Tom Hulce, he went crazy. He couldn't act after Mozart. Nope, not true.
But it's like, that's your way of like explaining the power of the role to yourself, So it's like, so yeah, and it's funny because like, I think there's some amount of self-deception and like acting that we all do, and that like lying and acting are part of humanity. Like we all do it to some extent. And so it's just interesting, like, where does it get dangerous, right? Like I was watching Magnolia yesterday, which is one of my favorite movies, and it's just like so intense, and like every actor in that movie like has to go to a place as part of their role and just like be in it. And watching it made me think about, I studied acting in college, and spent enough time thinking about it to find really appealing the idea of like, and I used to have this book that I forget even who wrote it, but it was just like a basic audition book that was like how to audition. And it had this amazing core advice, which is like, find the part of yourself that is this character, like find the you in this character, because if you're cold reading a scene and you have 10 minutes to prepare, like, you're not going to craft a scene, are you? Like, you just have to show up as yourself and like be authentically inside of this person by finding the part of you that is them, basically. And I don't know where that audition book went, but it was great. And so just, you know, watching people like truly act, it's like you are living an experience that isn't literally true. And like, there's clearly something about us as people that like, that is like necessary and freeing for us. And people seem to do some of their best work when they're writing under a pseudonym or when they're sort of inhabiting some kind of different persona. And so it just feels like, you know, this is clearly behavior that can be very positive and very constructive in our lives. And then it, you know, and so the issue is not that, you know, that we're illogical and sometimes truth averse creatures, but just being like, okay, that's what we are. Like, we just are that. Like, that's not the bad part. The bad time happens when that impulse that we have and that sort of aspect of our nature takes us in a dangerous direction somehow.
Well, thank you, Sarah, so much for talking with us. Once again, this was Jessica and
Aaron.
And our guest was
Sarah Marshall.
And we're going to close this chapter of Turn the Page.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.